The Outer Space Treaty of 1967 is the dominant framework through which all nations of the world are expected to regulate their activities in space. But how did it come about, and what is its future more than 50 years after its signing? In this episode of Chai on the Moon, we have a conversation with NASA Fellow in the History of Space Technology and a doctoral student in the History Department at Princeton University, Haris Durrani. Hello and welcome to Chai on the Moon, where we talk about societal and ethical issues related to human settlements in space, in particular to the moon. But we're not completely wedded to that. Our guest today is Haris Durrani, and I will introduce him, but with a caveat, because it's really hard to encompass all of his various activities. So let me make an attempt at that. So he's a PhD student in the history department at Princeton University. His focus is on the histories of law, technology, and extraterritoriality in the 20th century. His dissertation follows legal disputes surrounding the first communication satellites launched in the 1960s. And so we will be talking about Outer Space Treaty today and the history of it surrounding that. And so that is the relevant part. But he's also interested in how some of these issues and the histories inform contemporary legal, regulatory, and political problems. He also has an interest in legal and historical questions about secularism, legal pluralism, Sharia, and Islamic sciences. In 23-24, so this is this year, he is the NASA Fellow in the History of Space Technology. This is part of the American Historical Association. And he's also at the Center for International Security Studies Fellow at the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. Okay, now I would have normally stopped at that. The thing is that he also has a JD, so law degree from Columbia Law School, and his undergraduate major was in applied physics. He also writes fiction, which intersects his interests in the historical and legal work. His debut book, Technologies of the Self, won the Driftless Prize, and his analysis of Frank Herbert's Dune has appeared amongst other places in the Washington Post and his discussions on NPR, etc., etc. So a really amazingly diverse bio. So please welcome Haris Durrani.
Thank you, Salman. It's too much, but it's really an honor to be here. I'm excited to talk about space, all things space.
Yeah, so thank you so much. And as you know, here we've been trying to look at, human settlements on the moon looks like that's going to happen. So it's not a question of if, but rather a question of when. And right now, and in some ways, this is where a lot of the precedents are going to be set for the future. And with your interest in both law and history, I think in terms of the intersection, this really is a central component to that. So let's just dive directly into it. The treaty that everybody talks about is the Outer Space Treaty. So can you, for audiences to get on the on the same page, can you describe, and I think the treaty is called the Treaty on Principles Governing the Activities of States in the Exploration and Use of Outer Space, including the Moon and other celestial bodies. So what is it?
Sure. No, that's it's a simple question, but a very important question. Right. So the Outer Space treaty that was signed in 1967, but it was sort of the result of negotiations happening since at least the late 50s, depending on how you historicize the treaty. And these negotiations and the treaty itself are essentially a way to think about how to govern the activities of human beings in outer space. The treaty is often seen as a bilateral, almost a kind of bilateral agreement, really, between the Soviet Union and the United States. But there were, of course, many other nations involved in these negotiations, and that ended up shaping the substance of what the treaty itself says. So the treaty goes through, we can talk in more detail, I'm sure, but the treaty goes through uh, several different issues from sovereignty and jurisdiction to the use of weapons and acts of war.
So if and correct me if I'm wrong, but I mean, I think that is the most, or that is the only comprehensive outer space treaty that exists, or are there others that sort of like, overlap it?
That is the only, it is often considered the constitution of space law. So there are various other conventions, some failed treaties, depending on how you define failure. But the space treaty is pretty much the only major treaty that's mostly regarded by most of the international community as uh, basically the word on space law. Everything else either has not as many signatories or is itself questionable in terms of its ability, its register in the international community.
Okay, and there are different articles to that treaty, and people oftentimes focus on different aspects of that. Can you give sort of like two or three places, two or three treaties, articles of the treaty that really are central, that are being discussed? Because there are more elements to it as well,
Right.
but certainly two or three elements are the ones that are central.
Right. So the first article famously says that space flight is the province of all mankind. It doesn't say, it's often read as space is the province of all mankind, but it actually says space flight. So it's a usufructuary right. It's not a right to a place. So the act of using space is for all mankind without discrimination based on the basis of development. Um, the second article famous is probably the most famous article, which says that no nation may claim sovereignty. Essentially, no nation may claim sovereignty or appropriation by other means in outer space or on celestial bodies. There's various other provisions. For example, there's a ban against the use of weapons of mass destruction. Noticeably, there's no explicit ban on the use of weapons in general in space. And there's also a very important provision later on that gets slept on, but I think is very important, which basically has to do with jurisdiction and how do you allocate jurisdiction and authority in outer space.
Yeah, and that is something that we are going to come down to, especially when we talk about how it's actually going to play out. Because, as you said, that this is the constitution of outer space in terms of how we are going to behave. So before we move on to sort of like, a little bit on the contemporary stuff, I mean, I really wanted your expertise on its history, because on the face of it, it's a little bit odd that this treaty in some ways has a lot of good elements to it, has a bit of utopian element to it, bit of because it talks about sort of like, okay, all mankind, I mean, apart from the gender aspects to it, okay, so all mankind, um, no nuclear or weapons of mass destruction or that type of thing, or I think of more specific nuclear stuff in there. Um, but this was signed at the height of the Cold War. This was signed in, I mean, the work was done in 60s, and then 67 it was signed. So how did it come about?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it might depend on which historian or lawyer you ask what the answer is. Sorry, that's my academic response. I think, the conventional explanation is in part largely right, which is that it came about through Cold War superpower competition. The US and the Soviet Union, especially after the launch of Sputnik, but even beforehand, but especially after Sputnik, we're really thinking about how do you allocate sovereignty, jurisdiction, the use of weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons in outer space. And this was basically a way, in part, for the US and the Soviet Union to say, okay, here's how we're going to try to deal with this new domain of technology, power, warfare, science. And I think that is very true as an explanation for how the treaty comes about. And in particular, it's kind of interesting, for example, initially the Soviets wanted to say that at least orbital locations sovereignty should be allocated based on the territory below. But once they launched Sputnik is going over everybody's territory. So then they changed their mind. So it's some of those kinds of conversations with the early rocket and space technology that generated the negotiations that eventually led about 10 years later to the space treaty. On the other hand, I think the Soviet Union and go ahead.
I was just gonna say, but I
You're
mean,
about to, yeah.
why would they agree to that? I mean, meaning to say, like, okay, so if it's a Cold War and both of these nations are looking for dominance, right? I mean, to a certain degree, why would they agree to something that is a bit more? It takes away. I mean, there is a little bit of a trust or concession already built into outer space treaty, and which is a problem right now, right? I mean, that's where we are right now. So why was
Mhm.
that? Why was there the two superpowers at that time willing
Mhm.
to give up some autonomy or power?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I have an ideological answer and then a more sort of historical answer. So the historical answer is one potential answer is that by the late 60s, I mean, to the degree the Cold War was hot, you're seeing a sort of chilling of some of the Cold War tensions and a move towards some kind of detente. So I think there's more of a willingness to compromise. That's the historical answer. My ideological answer, which I think is equally true, is that I think the space treaty doesn't really calm down that much. I think it creates boundaries and rules within which the competition can still continue. So it doesn't actually ban the use of weapons in space. And the prescription on claims of sovereignty, it doesn't really prevent anyone. It doesn't really stop the U.S. or the Soviet Union from doing any kind of sort of aggressive activities toward one another. They just can't do it in space. But the war, I don't think they ever really thought of the issue as having a war in space. It's always just the use of space to do stuff on Earth. So I think from that perspective, there are notable silences in the space treaty that still allow for these superpowers to continue to exercise their power. And I think the silences are definitely intentional. And that sort of leads to my other explanation, which is that the Soviet Union and the U.S. they were sort of the prime movers in getting the ball rolling. But once they get the ball rolling and they try to make this an international treaty, then they have to deal with all the other nations in the world. And once they have to negotiate with everybody else, that actually ends up changing the shape of what certain provisions look like and how they frame the language and rhetoric around those provisions.
I mean, I'm just wondering how much, like within the U.S. context, because the Vietnam War is going on, and of course there is civil unrest within the civil rights movements, and there's a lot of unrest in the U.S. and Soviet Union itself had its own issues. I mean, does that play a role in sort of like at least in space lowering the temperature a bit? Like that okay, well, and by 60 late 60s, I mean, it was still unclear whether the who was going to land first, but it's sort of like it was taking shape of where things are going. So did that have anything to do with sort of like like, hey, okay, at least we can take out expenditure in space or space as an arena from the hot conflict, where without necessarily changing the dynamics here on Earth?
Hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, your mention of Apollo is also important, and I'm sorry I neglected that. Which is, both nations were very aware that they were in a race to put the first man on the moon, and so the whole thing about national sovereignty, in large part, is an attempt to sort of preempt any attempt to claim sovereignty, but via whoever gets there first.
Yeah.
But you're also right. There's a lot of other stuff going on in this time period. There's a civil rights movement, and even more broadly, you're in an intense moment of decolonization, right? So in the late 1950s, you have the Bandung Conference, which is a major conference between many quote unquote global South developing nations around the world who are trying to sort of come together to essentially rewrite global inequality in some way. And you see the after effects of that throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And what you see in the negotiations around the space treaty, and especially the way the Soviets and especially the Americans portray the provisions of the treaty, is through that language and through the fears of sort of these developing nations. Americans want them to move away from communism and move towards liberal democracy, whatever that means. And there's rhetoric around the world about the role of civil rights in the United States, the role of the U.S. in Vietnam, And I think for that reason, you have all this kind of flowery language about mankind and irrespective of development that appears in at least the American way of talking about the treaty, and then ends up actually working its way into various provisions, because in many ways it's a response to decolonization and an attempt to say, hey, look, we're on your side, at least on the surface. Yeah.
Yeah, and in some ways, so is Soviet Union is also courting the newly sort of like decolonized nation. So I mean, I think that's a really interesting point, that both of those superpowers are also are trying to court these newly independent nations, and so they want to use that language to come in. And if I remember correctly, it was initiated by the U.S. this particular the Outer Space Treaty, or was it sort of like through some other means? How was it initiated?
I can't recall exactly who initiated. I guess it depends on what you mean by initiated, but I know there were essentially several UN General Assembly resolutions that had happened over the last at least 10 years prior to 1967. And so it was those series of resolutions. Many of the resolutions end up sort of feeding into different provisions of the Space Treaty. And the Space Treaty in some ways codifies these resolutions that happened over the last 10 years. But I can't say for sure. So it's sort of like which resolution, different ones are promoted by different countries.
Right.
Yeah.
And now with you mentioned about in fact, we have both talked about the colonial context coming in. I'm just wondering how, I mean, it got shaped, as you said, sort of like, with conversations with other countries for whatever motivations or whatever reasons were there. Do you think those played a big role from the colonial or from the countries that were post-colonial perspective, from the countries that were coming in? Do they see it that way? Sort of like, those countries that, well, the Outer Space Treaty is something that is more or less equitable, or do they see it in a different way? The countries that, smaller countries that were not directly participating in space, but still have a stake in it. How did they receive OST?
Yeah, that's a great question. And to be honest, I think there's not one answer, because every nation has its own perspectives, and then what they say at the UN for the treaty negotiations may be different from what they're actually thinking at home. And I think there's a lot more historical work. I've done some work on this for some countries, but there's a lot more work to be done to really empirically understand what I think that's really important to understand what the Space Treaty says, is to look at what these different perspectives were. But I will say that, at least from what I've seen, many countries were very skeptical of the treaty. So, for example, Brazil was a major player in the formation of Article 1 of the Space Treaty, where they wanted this language about province of mankind to mean that access to technologies to get into space would be equitably distributed, even to developing countries, even if they didn't have that technology. They wanted it to be a provision with some teeth. And what's very interesting is both the Soviet Union and the US get very frustrated by these. Brazil proposes this, and then several other quote unquote small, like, European countries and some countries in Latin, they start building on this. And the Soviets and the US are like, can you please just shut up and let this move? We're only on Article 1. Like, let's see, we haven't gotten to the rest of the treaty. And so so that language of, space flight is a province of all mankind, irrespective of degree of development. The development language was from the position of Brazil and these other smaller countries who wanted this to mean something else. So I think it's very interesting now, if you talk to a space lawyer today and you say, what does Article 1 mean? What does this province of all mankind provision mean? Most people will say, oh, well, it's a sort of general rhetoric about, space is the province of all space flight is the province of all mankind. Everyone is meant to be included, but it doesn't mean actually sort of having some kind of stricter sort of communist regime that shares the actual access to rocket technology, right? And that's even in the when the U.S. ratifies the Space Treaty in the Senate, they explicitly make that distinction. They say it doesn't have that kind of legal teeth. But I don't know, if you talk to other people from other nations, maybe they'd say, well, in our interpretation, it was always meant to mean something else. So it always kind of depends on your interpretation. And then even if you have your own interpretation, how much does it matter if you're not the one with the power to actually redistribute anything. So
And
yeah.
and not to mention, I mean, space has always been, and especially from the U.S. and the Soviet Union perspective, I mean, it was always a dual use thing. So military aspect or military uses of that were so closely tied that you don't want to share sort of like access to space equitably, because you'll be giving up that. So, I mean, I think they would want to keep that independent. Uh, okay, so let's and we'll keep on jumping back and forth, because I think the historical context is important to look at the present aspect of it. So today, of course, you have the Outer Space Treaty, and so, but it's going to get challenged, or at least its interpretation is going to get challenged. So perhaps somebody who looks at things from a historical perspective of how OST or Outer Space Treaty got formulated, shaped, and you also have expertise in the legal aspects to it. How do you see the future of Outer Space Treaty shaping up in the next, say, 5 years or so?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, one, I often see headlines that talk about how, oh, well, the space treaty is outdated. It doesn't account for a multipolar uh, globe. It doesn't account for corporations. It doesn't account for space mining, etc. Therefore, we need a new solution. We need a new framework for space law. Um, I really often disagree. I think those are clickbaity headlines
Hmm.
because, like the American Constitution, the space treaty is intentionally a labile instrument. It's very flexible in its interpretation. As I mentioned earlier, I think that's built into the structure, at least from the U.S. and Soviet perspective. So I don't think you really need to do much to build a new framework. Also, I don't think it's possible to do another treaty of that kind today, anyways.
Yeah.
But even if you could, I think it would be kind of a useless endeavor because you can just interpret your way through whatever using your own kind of legal thinking. And to deal with some of the specific questions, I'm sure you'll have more questions about this, but space mining is already considered in the space treaty to some degree. Again, depending on interpretation, the treaty already does incorporate the role of corporations. It allows for state supervision and jurisdiction over and authority over non-state entities, non-governmental entities. And it also, as I've mentioned, the space treaty was birthed in the wake of decolonization. How more multipolar of a world can you get than that, right? So I think all of the issues that we face today, whenever I'm in the historical archives and the records from the 1960s, sometimes I read stuff and I say, well, wow, this sounds exactly like headlines I see today. What's the
Yeah.
difference? I
Oh,
mean, there are important differences. I don't mean to elide that either, but I think it's important to recognize the continuity as well.
so if I can
Yeah.
say that, and you mentioned mining, so and that is one of those places which, when people they point to President Obama's actions, or President Obama's directive, uh, which was allowing U.S. based companies to profit off of mining in outer space, on the moon and beyond, right? Asteroids, moon, and asteroids beyond. And partly it was because there was a little bit of ambiguity whether, because you cannot own the moon or an asteroid or any other body according to the Outer Space Treaty. But the way President Obama's order interpreted that was that, but if you mine it, then you get to make profit off of that mined, changed, whatever, surface, or things like that, however we define it, right? um, and so that is one aspect which did not exist to a certain degree. There is a very specific type of interpretation, and my guess would be that to a certain degree it would get challenged. NASA last year, I think it got one of the firms, Houston-based firm, to actually do a contract for $1, where, like, they gave them, or like, 10 cents, and they said, like, that you can dig from one place and put it out to the other side, in specifically in order to challenge. So that is one part. And how is that taking place? And my second part, from what you mentioned, that companies, that in the Outer Space Treaty, it takes into account private companies, because they get tied to the country where they are registered. Well, except that A, you have multinational companies now, and B, it's like those shipping things where, like, you can get a flag from a smaller a country and things like that, and sort of like, which has different types of laws or whatever, like, there could be an incentive. So how do we take that into account, where, unlike the high seas, which, sure, it's high seas, but it's still on Earth, and here we are talking about space where, no pun intended, but the province is really big, and so what does that even mean?
No, that's two great questions. So the first question is about the mining, and the second question about corporations and flags of convenience. So on the mining question, right? So that was under Obama. There was a statute, the 2015 competitive space. I forget the full title, but 2015 statute under the Obama administration. And so I have I don't know how much you want to get into the weeds of this. I'll try to not get too weedy, because I do have an article that does get into the weeds. You can just look it up.
And we're gonna put it in the comments. So, like,
Awesome.
the link to that. Yes. Yeah.
Sounds great. But I think it's a very, I mean, one can criticize the statute, but I think the statute in some ways is smartly worded, because what it sort of says exactly is that, I'm only roughly paraphrasing, that space resources obtained. So it basically, it grants property rights to space resources obtained. So it assumes that you've already it's kind of what you said, Salman, that it assumes you've already taken out the resource, and now that you have it, you get a certain set of property rights to that resource that you've obtained. But it doesn't actually say anything about the legality of obtaining the resource itself. So it says nothing about the legality of the act of mining. It just said it. And if you look at the hearings in Congress, and when they were drafting the treaty, this issue exactly came up. Of there is an ambiguity in the space treaty about whether mining is allowed or not. And there's a lot of weeds in what that means, but there is an ambiguity. It's controversial in the space law community. And so the sort of smart response by some lawyers who were testifying before Congress, and then Congress kind of incorporated this response, was that, well, just avoid the question entirely. You grant the rights to the thing obtained, but you don't actually give a right to do the act of mining. And then it says elsewhere in the statute that the statute is meant to comport with international law. So if there is anything in the statute that would be against the space treaty, then it would incorporate whatever that interpretation would be. So I think the statute, like the space treaty, basically just kicks the can down the road. It doesn't really answer the mining question. And I think that's intentional. Because the mining question will get resolved when someone actually goes out and mines something.
Well, and that's what NASA is doing, right? I mean, that the contract is basically meant to test that, right? Because they're going to take it from one to another. Okay, so then what follows? Right. Okay, all right, yeah.
Yeah. And then
the corporation, yeah.
Yeah, so I always kind of laugh whenever people do talk about corporations, because a corporation is a statutory creature. Corporations are created by states. You have to have a charter and everything. You have to register with a state in order to have state. And you can go back to the British East India Company, and yes, in some ways the corporation was larger than the empire. You can talk about all that, but in our present day, that's kind of how the law operates for corporate creation, right? So no matter what, that's kind of what the Space Treaty is acknowledging, is that you have non-governmental entities, these corporations, but they're always going to be registered by a state. So the state is the one that ultimately has the authority over their activities in space. But you do raise a good point about flags of convenience. So, a corporation can just, incorporate itself somewhere where that state is not going to enforce whatever laws that it wants to avoid, the corporation wants to avoid. And I think that is a major obstacle. That's something for which I don't know. You'd have to think about if there should be some kind of treaty on or convention on flags of convenience and corporations in space. But I would also say that I don't know if this is an issue unique to space either. Like, it is true that stuff in space is in space, whereas stuff in the sea, you can at least kind of get to it. But I don't know, the sea is also a huge space, and oftentimes it's hard to enforce piracy and other kinds of activities that happen at sea as much as you can at space, and you cannot enforce and regulate in space. So I think in some ways this is kind of just par for the course of the regulation of corporations in the international space in general. I don't know if it's specifically a space problem, and to the degree it is a space problem, you're right. The space treaty doesn't really give an answer, but I don't know if we really have much of an answer anywhere else. But I would say that I think it's a double-edged sword, right? If you want to incorporate with a corporation that maybe is going to be more lax in its treatment of you as a corporation, that also means that you may not get all of the benefits of being incorporated in that state. Whereas if you're incorporated, say, in the United States, which has a whole set of regulatory measures, there's some stuff that's not going to be great for you, but also you'll get certain protections. And so it's sort of a matter of corporate and legal strategizing, at least from the corporation's perspective.
Right. I mean, one thing where I think sort of like it can be a little bit different from the sea or ocean or high seas, sort of like, is the fact that the stakes will be much higher in space, and it's the unlimitedness. You mentioned British East India Company, and I'm wondering, and I think you have written about it a little bit as well, in terms of the historical context with the out. I mean, obviously, now with all these private companies taking the lead, even though yes, they are connected to companies, but to nations, but in terms of going to space, like SpaceX, for example. I mean, NASA is using SpaceX, and the desire of somebody like Elon Musk is to go to Mars. And it's not desire based upon, hey, NASA is going to Mars. It's more about SpaceX is going to Mars. And so there is that element. And to a certain degree, it reminds me a little bit of the colonial context of the British East India Company or others, like, that, okay, they wanted to do that. And some of the laws, the corporate laws, in fact, the ones that you are talking about, were designed to encourage that, or and partly because that endeavor itself benefited, for example, if you talk about the British East India Company or Dutch East India Company, but certainly the British, back to England. Now, this must have been sort of like, part of people's minds, especially in the decolonialization going on when outer space treaty is being written. Did that play a role in conversations, and how did it shape up in terms of thinking about corporations and others?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yes, if you read Space Law Discourse from the 40s, it starts in the 40s at least, from the 40s to the 60s, the British East India Company does come up. So there's a book by Philip Jessup and Howard Taubenfeld called something like Controls for Outer Space and the Antarctic Analogy, or something like that. It's a book from I think the late 50s or early 60s. And it's interesting. Their analogy to the British East India Company in some ways has nothing to do with corporate regulation at all. It's really they love the British East India Company because they see it as like a legal structure, that it provided sort of secure, predictable legal infrastructure to resolve disputes in the British Empire. And over sort of a multifaceted set of different types of actors over lots of space. And they want to model space law on a similar, they sort of want a treaty system that's in some ways based on that legal structure. And they propose something like a Cosmic Development Corporation, CODEC, based on the British East India Company. But for them, it's interesting. It's not really about corporations. It's more about legal process and procedure, and having this kind of strong set of legal procedures, even if there's no sort of strong substantive rules. But if you have a strong set of procedures, that will incentivize investment in spaceflight, either from corporations or nations, and therefore generate innovation. Because if you know kind of what the procedures are that you can expect, therefore there's some sense of security when you're investing in these huge projects to go to space. And in that context, they actually do bring up decolonization as well, because they say that, unfortunately, since Woodrow Wilson, nations, these developing nations, they keep talking about equity and equitable distribution, But if you have these strong procedures, then they can't really. It's just like words. It's just words and doesn't mean anything if you just have the strong procedural constraints. So that's the historical part of the answer to your question. The question about Musk, I think, is very interesting because I'm not a historian of the British Empire, but my understanding is that in some ways the British East India Company was larger than the British Empire, and in some ways, sometimes some historians argue that the empire was almost in some cases subservient to, or sort of a lower power level than the company. I know there's historical debate about that. I'm not trying to take a side one way or another, but I think what's interesting is that you might, if that's true, you might have almost an inversion of that with Elon Musk, right? So if he goes to Mars and sets up his own colony slash corporation there, I think that is another, I will say that is one lacuna in the space treaty, that the idea of someone forming a nation ex nihilo in outer space is a hole in the space treaty. And it's really, I mean, the space treaty deals with existing nations. It doesn't deal with the idea of someone going out somewhere and creating their own nation. That wasn't really in the purview of the space treaty. And I think that will be an interesting question to see if Elon Musk goes to Mars and tries to create his own colony. I think that's interesting from a legal perspective. From a practical perspective, I'm very skeptical because even if he goes out there, he still relies on government subsidies and regulation for launches. I think he's still going to, in a practical sense, rely so much, especially on American infrastructure and administrative state and funding, that even if he claimed he was creating his own nation, I think for practical purposes, he would still be in some way subservient to the U.S. state.
And you need recognition. I mean, it's certain.
Yeah.
I mean, as a new country, or whatever. Although he did try to put in a clause in the Starlink contract, right. That on Mars he would be independent. The other thing that you mentioned, and again, is Antarctica. And you mentioned sort of that these guys, which by the way was a surprising twist to that they looked at British East India Company as a positive example of the legal structures. But yeah. Antarctica itself, the way it has turned into as a research base to a certain degree, without sovereignty of any nation. Now, is that something that you think is closer to both the spirit of OST and also both in terms of the moon settlements, or you think that Antarctica was just a one-off case, which was an oddity?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yes, Antarctica was very much on people's minds. I think the Antarctic Treaty system is very much in the spirit of the Space Treaty, and they both, essentially the Space Treaty and the Antarctic Treaty, in large part, both came out of something called the International Geophysical Year in the late 1950s, which was a joint collaboration between many nations across the world, not just U.S. and Soviet Union, to essentially measure the globe. So the atmosphere, space, the sea, the environment. And so in large part, the Space Treaty and the Antarctic Treaty and part of the various law of the sea conventions came out of trying to deal with certain issues about national security, scientific exploration and measurements, and warfare and resource exploitation that came out of the various sort of international scientific civilian activities that happened around the IGY, the International Geophysical Year. So there's a great sense of international collaboration. So in that sense, I think you're right. There is something of the spirit of the Antarctic Treaty that's shared through its genealogical origin with the Space Treaty. And I think you even sort of see that in the attempt to come to some kind of compromise, even though, of course, as we've talked about, there's still allowance for national security interests, but within a kind of global framework of understanding on certain things. From a legal sense, I think there are some important differences, mainly the fact, I'm not an expert on the Antarctic Treaty System, but my understanding is that the treaty system essentially put a moratorium or a pause on claims of sovereignty. So no one else can further claim sovereignty in parts of Antarctica, but those nations which already have sovereign claims do have those claims, but they're essentially put on pause.
Huh.
And I believe it's going to be sometime. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe sometime relatively soon that moratorium will be, like, the end of that period will be finished. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. And whereas I think by contrast, the space treaty, there are no claims at all of sovereignty, at least none that are sort of recognized by most nations. I mean, there's some post-colonial claims, but that's a different thing. So I think it creates a different set of legal issues. And I think so if we're talking about moon bases and the analogy to moon bases, I think the you don't really have to deal with the question of sovereignty because you can just make it a jurisdictional problem, and you can just the space treaty allows for allocation of jurisdiction over spacecraft, and you can foreseeably try to do something else with moon bases.
And I think the Antarctic Treaty is 1959, I think, right? I mean, or something around that. So
Yeah, yeah.
so it's precedes about 8 years before the Outer Space Treaty. So do you think? Yes, there won't be any issue of sovereignty, but now it will be unfair. But I'm going to ask you to put a hat, sort of like a bit of your science fiction hat, maybe, but also your legal hat again. How do you see? I mean, and again, those are two good comparisons. So Antarctic Treaty and Antarctica, the way it has moved forward, it has stayed within the realm of neutrality, even though there are natural resources there, even though there could have been a push to go in a particular direction, but Antarctica has stayed relatively stable in that direction. Um, and the moon is just sort of like starting to take shape. How do you think where the settlements on the moon, where do you think they are going to go in light of both the example of Antarctica, OST, and then with Artemis and the Chinese station? I mean, how do you see it taking shape?
Yeah, I think it's fun to play with all these legal questions, but I think ultimately it will be in a sort of real politics sense about sovereignty. Because yes, space is big, the moon is relatively big, but the location of the most precious resources that are most easily accessible given the terrain and the sort of where you launch from and so on, that is to some degree scarce. And there will end up inevitably being some kind of conflict, either sort of physical or diplomatic, over how to allocate those scarce resources on the moon. And I think inevitably that has to, even if you don't call it sovereignty, it is kind of a sovereign question. I've guest lectured a course on space law at Columbia Law School a few times, and I always show them a clip from the TV show For All Mankind. And there's a scene in there where the Soviet and the American astronaut the astronauts are fighting over the same set of resources, and they have a debate, and their debate is basically, this is my territory. No, I think the American says this is our territory, and the Russian says no, I thought space is for everybody, or something like that. So you can kind of use the language, but the real politic of the thing is that whoever is there is there. And I think it'll be interesting to see. I mean, there are provisions of the space treaty that essentially deal with harmful interference, that you're supposed to notify other actors in space, if you're going to harmfully interfere with their activities, and vice versa. But that provision has never really been put into practice, and it only requires consultation with the UN. It doesn't really. There's not like a legally enforceable mechanism. There's no kind of court procedure or anything. I think ultimately it's going to be either up to diplomacy, some recognition of reciprocity, that we're all in the same, this kind of tragedy of the commons logic, that we're all in the same thing together, or it'll be about physical force. And to be honest, I don't really know which way it will go. Because I think, physical force, in some ways you could say, well, if you do exercise some kind of military action in space, especially on the moon, it's going to screw up everybody. Because, if you have one puncture in one module, then everybody dies, right? And even if you have separate modules, you start shooting at each other or something, everyone's screwed. So I think at the end of the day, diplomacy will probably be the way it shakes out. But I don't know if that's naive or not. I hope that's the way it shakes out.
So it's funny, by the way. My last question for you today was actually about For All Mankind. I wanted to ask you
Mm,
about that. So it's funny that you bring it up. And for those people who don't know For All Mankind, I mean, I think it's a fun moving show, like, so it just keeps on going. It's by the same creators as Battlestar Galactica. So if you're familiar, the new one, the 2001s. So there is a lot of melodrama that keeps the plot chugging. Uh, and but the one of the key things is that it's an alternate history where the Soviets get to the moon first before our landing is there, and so that's what triggers it. And it was interesting. And again, I will talk about a little bit about For All Mankind with you, because there the question does come up, and in fact, a very particular scene that you are talking about is about getting guns there first. Or should there be guns there or not? And that was uh, and there was a conversation about that, because again, outer space treaty prevents nuclear weapons and other types of things, but should there be guns there or not? And the fear of the other, basically, like, that of course they would be doing that, and hence we must do that, right? I mean, so that's the argument, by the way, for today, for AI or for any other thing. It comes in, should we regulate? No, 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 no. But if we regulate, China will do it anyways, right? and
yeah,
and so
the
that
nuclear weapons too.
it's the
Yeah,
same. So
with
it's the
Oppenheimer.
same. Exactly. So it's the
Yeah,
same dynamic that. Uh, I mean, that was in fiction, but that is in fiction. But on the other hand, in reality, AI, we are seeing that Oppenheimer. We saw the nuclear thing, and we are going to see the same kind of thing with Artemis Accord countries versus the Chinese alliance, China alliance moon base over there. Um, so, do you think the Artemis Accord, from what I understand, they are trying to get ahead of the game to a certain degree? That, okay, well, if the US aligned countries sign, and there are large enough countries, then they get to define the finer points of the outer space treaty? Or do you think the goal is to keep things more ambiguous? So is it really refining outer space treaty for this time, or is it taking it another direction but keeping it vague, because there are
mm,
other issues that, I mean, there are advantages to being vague, and that was in the outer space
mm,
treaty. So how do you see the Artemis Accord?
yeah. Yeah, that's a great, and thanks for bringing up Artemis Accord because I should have mentioned that in my first response. But yeah, I don't know if it's refining or if it's just keeping the door open. Um, I think maybe it's just keeping it's providing it's almost like the codec or something. Like it's providing a set of procedures that doesn't really change much about the space treaty, but keeps the door open. And what I mean by that is so my understanding of the Artemis Accords is that it posits zones on the moon where different actors can operate for mining.
Yeah.
And it smartly avoids talking about sovereignty or appropriation in that context. So in that way, it's kind of keeping the door open. I mean, if you have a zone that you have exclusive authority over, that sounds like sovereignty to me. But if you don't call it sovereignty, I guess it's not sovereignty. So it's kind of keeping that holding that ambiguity open. I like, and to some degree, I really like the Artemis Accords because it reminds me a lot of my favorite piece of space law in terms of as a lawyer is the international the intergovernmental agreement of the space station, the ISS agreement, because it's kind of slept on. Nobody thinks about it, but I think it's the most practical, most useful international space law thing since the space treaty, because it sort of basically takes the space treaty's provisions on supervision, authority, and jurisdiction and applies them to the space treaty, and basically allocates jurisdiction for patents and other issues on the space station according to each nation. It's not that radical of an instrument, but it basically says, okay, this is a basic principle from the space treaty. Let's apply it to this, giant object in space and see what happens. And it worked pretty successfully. I mean, I will say there haven't been many conflicts where jurisdictional issues have come up. So who knows it would have held together if there were major conflicts. But I do like it as a model, and I think the Artemis Accords is trying to do a similar thing, where it's saying, okay, we have these principles about national appropriation in space and harmful interference, and let's try to kind of create a procedure to just apply that in some way that doesn't move the needle one way or another, but just applies it in a practical way.
I mean, but that brings back. I mean, again, because of your expertise in history, I want to go back to it because, I mean, the International Space Station was in this. Russia, first of all, was not supposed to be in it, right? I mean, and then they were included in it, and it's sort of from the Freedom Space Station to it became the International Space Station, and which was a good thing, but it was also at a very particular moment in time in the 1990s where you have for better or for worse, whatever the unipolar world was supposed to be, right? And then you have the 1960s, 50s, and 60s where you have a Cold War where Soviet Union, in some sense, had gained parity, and with the Sputnik, I mean, in some sense, leapt forward ahead of the US. So when that is being placed, there is this notion that you have another superpower which is at the same level, right? And in fact, US is trying to catch up. I mean, that was the original context to that. And there is no second superpower in the 1990s. But now it's a different context because of a rising superpower, and that's where sort of the containment of China comes in, and so on and so forth. And so, how do you see that play a role? Because and I also want to ask you about, are there similar kind of protocols that Chinese space station, moon base, are they planning on doing or not? But how does that play a role in how do you think, from the historical context, that you have these different kinds of structures, political contexts, that these things are being written and being playing out?
That's a great question, right? Because I think, as we've been talking about, the space treaty came out of this point of, it was very, in some ways, ideological. Whether you want to characterize it as a bilateral superpower competition, or even through the lens of decolonization. And I think there was a very strong element of, economic questions, especially from the decolonial perspective, and even when they talk about in the space treaty negotiations, resource exploitation. Even though that doesn't come into the space treaty itself, it's underlying the structure. But ideology plays a huge role there. Whereas when you get to the ISS agreement in the 1990s, you're right, it's a quote unquote unipolar world, and I think in many ways the sort of the legal structure that you see in the space station reflects more, I would say, economic competition, and even the creation of the station. If you look at when they were first planning it, when Reagan announced that it was going to be the Freedom Station and it was an American station, it was seen as this hub of industrial growth, essentially. And this is going to be, it's going to generate industrial booms in pharma, in microchip development, all these microgravity experiments. And by the late 80s, some of that hullabaloo kind of dies down. And I think in some ways, that's also why America ends up aligning with the Soviets to do the space station, because they probably realize it's not going to make as much money, and it never does make as much money as they think it will. And then also, I think that's one way to explain maybe the involvement of Japan as well later on in the station, where Japan, especially in the 90s, was seen as a major competition to the US. And of course, these economic factors also are ideological as well, and about kind of US superpowerdom, but through an economic lens. But I think that's one way to explain the difference is, maybe more of an ideological geopolitical focus in the 60s and some kind of more economic focus in the 80s and 90s.
Not to mention that the Soviet Union had the space station that existed. Mir space station was the Soviets, so they did have the experience in terms of getting a structure up there. So I think that was also there.
Right. Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's what I'm saying, that the Americans, I think they realized it was going to cost too much and that if they were going to do it on their own. Oh, I think I lost you.
Yeah.
Saman, I lost you for a second there. You're frozen still.
Yeah, I think so. I think now, am I okay now? You are
I
moving
can
now.
hear you, but you're frozen for me.
Oh, okay. Let me move a little. Is that okay now?
You're moving very slowly.
Okay. Well, that should be okay. So we should, yeah, but that's the advantage of recording on our ends, like, that it will be okay when it comes out and we can edit
Sure,
this part, this conversation part.
sure.
Is it okay now or am I still slow?
You're very slow, but I can hear you perfectly.
Okay. Uh, so now, if we move this to the current situation with China, which I mean, in some sense, it's both economic and potentially military conflict. How do you see that taking place on, especially regarding moon bases?
Mhm.
Because I mean, you talked about limited resources, and for all mankind has Soviet Union and America, but the US and China are going for the same places, the lunar South Pole. Water is available on the poles. And so, I mean, to a certain degree, that's going to take place. So, how do you see? Uh, are you aware of Chinese uh, equivalent of the Artemis Accord? And is it different or is it the same?
No, that's a great question. Yeah, I'm not sure what. To be honest, I'm really not sure what's going to happen with China and moon bases. My guess is probably as good as yours. I think my sense is that it very much depends on what the geopolitics are at home. I think no matter what, we're going to be dealing with scarce resources, like you said. But I think it's going to depend largely on what the diplomatic relationship is between the U.S. and China by the time we actually get bases up there. Um, because I'm I'm even though I do really believe in realpolitik and that in some ways law doesn't really do that much. Uh, on the other hand, I'm skeptical that Chinese and U.S. actors on the moon are going to actually get in a fist fight of any kind, um, purely out of their own self interest. And I think they'll be more interested in coming to some kind of diplomatic solution. As for China having their own alternative to the Artemis Accords, that's a great question. I honestly don't have a good answer for you.
I mean, because their objections to Artemis Accord, even though I don't think legally they can sign it because U.S. has barred cooperation in space with China, so I don't know if they can officially sign it or not. But at least the word goes like, well, they can, and China and Russia have both said that they don't want to sign something that is not approved by the United Nations. So that's the excuse that is being used. But obviously, it needs to be more finely tuned. Uh, are you familiar with? I had read recently that there is a conversation about the common time on the moon. So there is a conference going on, and this problem was raised about a year ago uh, because if there are going to be spacecrafts over there, there's going to be orbital stations over there, which both Chinese alliance countries and the US aligned Artemis, they are both planning on making. Then they will be using clocks, and it's a pretty tricky question, like that about keeping time, but that are local on the moon rather than being synchronized here on Earth, because that has all kinds of issues and so on and so forth. So there is a place where there is this issue that's coming up, that can all countries agree on a universal time,
Hmm.
and that would be crucial for launching on the moon, orbiting on the moon. Otherwise, if people are keeping different times, then there are far more chances of collisions and so on and so forth. Have you heard about that, or sort of like
No, that's absolutely fascinating. I'm curious to see where that goes. But I mean that does remind me that even in general on the conflict with China, the question of conflict with China, I think inevitably, um, you do have, politicians and military personnel that are involved in these projects, but I think you also have scientists who are probably going to end up working on the clock question, on the time question, right? And
Right.
the scientists, I think, will be more interested in scientific collaboration and international collaboration than they will be in conflict. And I think that's maybe one way in which we might see a de-escalation if there is any move towards an escalation.
Yeah, well, that's really interesting. Okay, so towards the end, I mean, again, I wanted to go from the for all mankind direction, but and by the way, I haven't seen the new season. I haven't started
Me
watching
neither.
the latest season, uh, but I'm just curious. I know you've mentioned about realpolitik aspect and de-escalation, uh, but how do you have an optimistic take? And this is not just in terms of political and military relations, but also if we put in the context of, I mean, resource extraction. And I mean, humans have not exactly done a great job here on Earth. And so that is also going to be taking place. How do you see the future? I mean, do you think that better side of our angels are going to, I would say, do things that we haven't done here on Earth before. Like, are they going to take over, or do you think that this is going to be a challenge? And if it is a challenge, then how do we counter that?
Mm. Yeah, I think my optimism is a it's a political optimism that's backed by technological skepticism, and I'll explain what I mean by that. Which is, I'm very skeptical that technology anytime soon is going to get to the point of mass extraction of resources from anywhere, be it the moon or an asteroid. And I think as a result of that, you're not going to get to these uh, you're not going to escalate to these massive political or military conflicts very quickly. And I think also there are some interesting questions of economic feasibility. So if you're mining something from an asteroid, and you take some valuable resource and you introduce it to the economy, then the value of that resource will just drop dramatically. So I think, and then if I guess if you're on the moon, the value of the resources is more to just keep doing more stuff to go further into space. And I think there's less of a, uh, uh, it's less about domination of Earth from any kind of political, economic, uh, 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 military view, and more about scientific exploration. Although, of course, claiming the scientific exploration is part of the kind of grandstanding of nation states or corporations. But I think there's a bit more of a remove from direct military, political, economic conflicts. So I think because I'm skeptical about the technological, and economic um, rapid escalation of these kinds of mining extractive technologies, uh, I'm politically optimistic because I don't think it's going to lead us to a point of dramatic escalation.
That's really interesting, uh, and because the way it looks like that at least the private corporations are going into that direction. Can I modify my question and to say
Sure.
more about the kind of work that you also do? What about the lower orbit, sort of like, meaning to say, on Earth you have satellites taking all over, like, and there the economic. So what I'm trying to say is, you mentioned about the economic stuff, that technologically that's a little bit farther off, and because it's a little bit farther off, the economic value is less, and because economic value is less, the political implications are not as severe, and hence you are politically optimistic. uh am I right? I mean, that's their argument. And so I'm curious about a trajectory. If we go from the Earth and start looking at it, it's a lot more cluttered on the low, on sort of like, not as close to Earth you are, but in space. Do you think of Earth and Moon system? Do you think a really big, uh, sort of like, space, no pun intended, but sort of like, a real boundary, or do you think it's going to turn into a continuum, kind of like where sort of like, cities and suburbs come in, and you come in sort of like, living on the East Coast. You and I are both on the East Coast, where cities just extend onto some other thing. Or do you think that there's going to be stay this very big gap in between, and hence your optimism?
Hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. If we're gonna have what would you call it? I guess a translunar
Yeah, it
economy
is
slash
extension.
society.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Again, I'm not. Uh, well, I guess I was gonna say I'm not. I am an engineer by training, but in terms of thinking about aerospace technology and the development of aerospace technology, I guess I was just trying to caveat my continuing skepticism
Okay. Yeah.
to make it not seem so. I think it would be really cool if we got to that stage where there's sort of some kind of relatively frequent interaction in social and political and economic movement between a moon base and various orbital locations, orbital slots, and then Earth, and that's all kind of like one ecosystem with various degrees, kind of. Um, but I think if we get there, probably be in like 100 years. Uh, uh, yeah, because it just takes so much money and expense to get to the moon. The moon is pretty far. I mean, it's close in the span of the solar system, but it's still pretty far away. Um, and to have any kind of sustainable, regularly working economy at that scale, we haven't even been to the moon with people since for
22.
decades.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, who knows? Like maybe, but I don't know if the political, social, or economic will is there. Um, so I think if we do get to that stage, it'd probably be I would probably be dead. Maybe, who knows? Like we'll probably have. I think it'll be on the way, but I don't know. Yeah, I'm just very. I think it would be cool, but I just wonder like what would the political or economic payoff be to develop? Like, why would people want to buy into that kind of
Hmm.
system? Um, yeah.
All
Sorry,
right.
that's not.
No,
That's
I
not a
think
very
that's
exciting
great.
answer.
No, I think that's great. Well, Horace, thank you so much for your time, and good luck finishing up. And hopefully we will have further conversations about it. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Salman. It's really an honor. It's exciting to talk with you about space.